Welcome to the Relational Grace Podcast, where we share the teachings of Pastor Nick Harris, who taught us that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. I'm Jamie Russell, Pastor Harris's son. As we get into the second episode of the Courage and Confrontation series, we remember that God had always prepared men to do the work that He'd called them to do. In the days of King Ahab of Israel, the situation called for a man like Elijah the Tishbite, and Elijah was ready to do the job, at least in part. The easy part was to march into the throne room of Ahab and announce to the king, "It ain't going to rain no more." And he did just that. From there, the task facing the prophet would become far more arduous. He needed more training, and the Spirit of the Lord knew exactly how to prepare Elijah for what was to come. The situation was this: God was displeased with the idolatrous practices of the children of Israel, so He chose to chastise them by sending a great drought upon the land. Baal, the god to whom they turned, was worshipped as the god of the storm. So in sending this drought, God was saying to Israel, let's see if the God of the storm has the power to end a drought that Yahweh had ordained. As Pastor Harris will share, once the announcement of the impending drought was declared, Elijah was told to go hide himself in a deep Wadi or canyon in Transjordan. To prepare his men for a coming war, God had called Elijah to go to a place of solitude and isolation, and it was in the best interest of the prophet to obey his God. There in the Wadi, God met the physical needs of the prophet. God provided abundant water from a spring. He had sent ravens to bring Elijah meat to sustain him. In this, God was teaching Elijah to live from his divine hand. Of course, the Lord could have sent angels instead of ravens to minister to Elijah, but God demonstrated to his prophet that He could use even the lowest creature to do his bidding. However, eventually the brook of the Wadi ran dry, and the ravens ceased to come. The prophet lost his supply just when it appeared that he needed them the most. But the prophet would find that there is a river that makes glad the city of God, a river that never runs dry, a well of water that springs up to eternal life. So with that introduction, let's jump into the second teaching of the Courage and Confrontation series titled The Dry Brook.
Now, last Sunday morning, we followed Elijah, a true man of God, into the throne room of the King of Israel. And we heard him announce a curse upon the morally and spiritually corrupt nation of Israel. Elijah looked into the eyes of King Ahab ben Omri, and he said to him, as Tim said, "It ain't gonna rain no more." Then he turned on his heels and stomped out of the place. Of course, no one, not one soul in that throne room that day paid a lick of attention to this ignorant hillbilly from Gilead. In fact, they probably had a good laugh at his expense, don't you think? And then they went right along with their business as usual. Now, what these political movers and shakers did not know was this: the God of Israel was through with the whole lot of them. Now, these men, including King Ahab, had dragged the nation of Israel into a deep hole. The country had become what I can only call a moral cesspool, and God was sent to bring an end to all of this, and that is why He sent Elijah. But just because Elijah had delivered the word of the Lord, as he had been told, did not mean that God was through with Elijah. I mean, God rarely just has one task for us to do. God often has a series of things. In fact, when He called me into the ministry, I was hoping He only called me for 1 week. But He called me for a lifetime, and that's kind of the way it was with Elijah. You see, God had great things in store for this hillbilly from Gilead. But before God could use him further, there were certain things that Elijah had to learn. Now, that was certainly true of me when I went into the ministry. I'll never forget that first Sunday. I asked my pastor, Dr. Thomas, I said, "Dr. Thomas, how do you get a sermon?" I mean, I didn't even know how to get one. He said, "Well, it's a good place to start is the Bible." I said, "Well, that sounds logical." And so I asked another young pastor, I said, "What was the first text you used on the first Sunday?" He said, "I'll tell you what it was. The text was that Jonathan went into the wood and strengthened David's hand in the Lord." Boy, that sounds like a good text. And where's that found? So he told me. And I went and I read that text and I started getting a little inspiration. And so Dr. Thomas told me, he said, "Just put it down on 3x5 cards." And so I put it all down. I have my sermon down. Now, this little church in Carmen didn't have any air conditioning. And it was June 6th, and one of those notorious northwest Oklahoma storms swept in, and our building faced from east to west. So the windows were open on the north and the south. And so I'm getting up there, and I get about 3 cards into my series of cards when a gust of wind comes through and goes, boy, that was a moment. Oh, it was horrible. I mean, I can't even tell you. Well, that sermon was over in about 3 minutes. I mean, it was one of the briefest sermons ever preached, I guess. I just said to the people, God sent me here. I'm going down in the woods. I hope I can strengthen your hand in the Lord. And then I go out to the front door. Well, those farmers came out and they all said, boy, we're going to like you. You are going to end up being our very favorite preacher. Listen, I had a lot to learn. I'll never forget our district superintendent came by one day. He said, Nick, now, it's you guys are supposed to have a charge conference now, and you're one of the first ones on the list. Yours will happen in August, so yeah, just be prepared for that. That's the first major thing that you got to do coming up, Dr. Lemuel Finn. So it came time for the charge. I didn't know what a charge conference was. Nobody ever explained that to me. I thought it was to check and see if the church was in debt. So I went to the treasurer and said, do we owe any debts? He said, no. So that night, the district superintendent came up, walked into the church. There's not a living soul there but me. He said, where is everybody? I said, what do you mean, where is everybody? He said, there's supposed to be a charge conference. I said, yeah, we don't owe anything. He said, what? He said, a charge conference is where you elect your officials for the next year. You establish your church budget. I went, oh. Just a lot to learn when God calls you. He doesn't just open up a flap on your brain, peel your head back, and drop a bunch of stuff in there. There are things to be learned, and Elijah was about to find that out. See, before God could use him, past just saying it ain't going to rain no more, God had to open up his mind, and God had to speak to him. God had to reveal things to him. And the lessons would begin immediately. In fact, they began as soon as the prophet left Ahab's throne room. Suddenly, the divine voice began to speak to him and began to direct his steps. The voice first instructed him to begin to walk in an easterly direction, which he did. And some 16 miles later, he arrived at the Jordan River. And once there, God told him to travel another 15 miles toward the south, which he did. And he said, once there, I want you to cross the river at the fords of the Jordan, which once again he did. Then he was told to travel on toward the east, where he would enter into the mouth of a deep wadi, or, as we said a moment ago, a deep canyon. Now listen, I want to tell you, this was some wadi. It was then and it is now. You see, this wadi becomes so deep in places that it would remind you a lot of the Royal Gorge in Colorado. It's a deep, deep place. It's called in Hebrew the Wadi Harith. But now, in your King James Bible, you'll often find it described as the brook Harith, or the brook Harith. You clear your throat at the beginning. But it's in Hebrew, Harith. And Elijah would not only enter into this place, but he would live in this wadi for the next year or more. But in spite of the remoteness, in spite of the ruggedness of the place, God wasn't bringing him there for the purpose of playing mind games with him. See, God hadn't directed him to come out here into this wilderness place to play with his mind. Now, it's really interesting that this word in Hebrew, harith, means to be cut off. God had taken him to a place where he was cut off. Not to play games, as I said, but to teach Elijah his way. Now, God didn't lead him to this place to punish him or torment him. You see, God had sent him here for the reason of preparing him to fight a war. To fight a war for the honor of God. God's honor was at stake. Israel was worshiping Baal. This has to stop. And so now God has brought him here to prepare him to fight this war against idolatry. Now the truth is, God knew that before Elijah could ever wage such a war, he would first have to be shaped into a man that God could use. And God knew that Elijah would have to be totally alone with him before that could ever possibly happen. Now, I want you to notice what God said to Elijah as he was leading him toward the Wadi Harit. It's found in 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 3. Look at this. He says, "Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Harit," or the Wadi Harit, "which flows into the Jordan." Okay? He gives him explicit instruction. Now, I want you to notice this word. See, that's kind of a strange word, isn't it? Because we're thinking of Elijah as this mighty man of faith. He's supposed to just stand up and say, "Bless God in the name of Jesus." You know, all that. Well, what does he do? He says, he's to go hide. Now, the first thing I say is, now wait a minute here. But I want you to see that he doesn't go and hide on his own. Look at this. God said, this is God's instructions to him. He says, "Get away from here and turn eastward and hide." This is God's instruction to him. See, Elijah, I don't believe Elijah had any fear of his own. If he'd have been afraid, he'd have never walked into the throne room and looked at the king in the eyes and said, "It ain't going to rain no more." That could have cost him his head. This man is not afraid. He wasn't full of fear. No, it was God. God who told him to go hide. In other words, God did not send Elijah to live in this remote wadi because God was afraid that somehow Ahab and Jezebel would find the prophet and kill him. As you know, God wasn't concerned about those two people. If God would have wanted to, He could have smitten them dead in a second of time. I mean, that wasn't the issue. He could have spoken a word, and that evil king and his queen would have just fallen over. So why did God tell Elijah to hide himself? God told Elijah to hide himself so that the two of them could be alone together. So the two of them could spend quality time. Elijah needed this. He needed to be set apart so he would be free from all distractions. You see, God had to teach the prophet this important lesson. He had to teach the prophet how to lean entirely upon Him. Now, beloved, God needs to do that with some of us. Nick needs to learn this lesson much better than Nick's ever learned it. I need to learn to depend on God and not on me. I need to learn to lean on the everlasting arms. I need to learn to trust God to the fullest for every necessity of life. And the Wadi Harit was a great place for Elijah to do that. You see, there was nothing in that place that the prophet could have done for himself other than trust God. I mean, there's no grocery stores at the Wadi Harit. Hello. There are no iPads or iPods or laptops. There's nothing out there that you can depend on for yourself. You are totally at God's disposal when you're in that place. Now, in this wadi, he couldn't have provided a single place for himself. So, here there were no friends to lean on, right? All he had was his God, and absolutely nothing else. Now, beloved, that was a tough way to learn a lesson. But it's the best way I know for a person to get really close to God. And that to be in a place where you can't help yourself. That's when we learn to trust. You see, when we are totally cut off, isolated and all alone, and God is all we have, He truly becomes a friend to us. Now, some of you know my oldest son, Deke, was an airborne ranger in the United States Army in the late 1980s. And as most of you also know, the Rangers are an elite military unit that specializes in leadership development. Now, it's tough to qualify for Ranger training, and even tougher to graduate. In fact, one time Deke told me that Ranger training is the closest thing to hell on earth that you can ever experience. Ranger training lasts for a total of 56 days, and it's divided into 4 sections or 4 phases. Now, the first phase is called the beginning phase. And in this phase, the instructors begin to break the candidates down so they can rebuild them as leaders. One way they do this is to deny the candidates the basic necessities of life. For 56 days, they're allowed to eat no more than one meal a day. And some days they're given no food at all. And they're only allowed 3 hours sleep each night. And when this beginning phase is finally completed, these now physically and mentally exhausted candidates face 3 more phases. The mountain phase, the swamp phase, and the desert phase. Now the swamp phase is where most of the candidates begin to drop out. But the group is really reduced during the hellish desert phase. By this time in the training, the candidates are beginning to hallucinate from sleep and food deprivation. No fat is left at all on their bodies, and they begin to burn muscle tissue for energy. It is sheer torture. In fact, at day 53, Dick told me that he began to wonder if he had 3 more days left in him. And then on the 54th day of training, he was doing a night patrol along the edge of a deep desert arroyo. He was all alone. He hadn't slept for 48 hours. Suddenly, almost in a stupor, he stumbled and rolled head over heels down the side of the steep embankment. His body was torn by rocks and the thorns of the desert acacia plant. Stunned, bruised, and bleeding, he lay in the arroyo, unable to move. And as he was relating the story to me, he said, "Dad, I knew I was totally alone." These are the words he used. I was cut off. I was in a condition of hurry, cut off from everything. He said, "Dad, I couldn't do anything else but just lay there and cry out to God." He said, "I said to God, God, you've got to help me, or I'm going to die right here." He said, "All I could think of were those words you taught me when I was only 5 years old. So I started to repeat them over and over again." And what were those words? I can do all things through Christ. It's strength. And then he said something happened. He said he experienced a kind of theophany. He said, "Dad, I don't know whether it was hallucinating. I don't know what was going on." He said, it was like a pair of hands reached under me and picked me up and set me on the opposite side of the embankment, very close to my base camp. He said, I opened my eyes, and there was Jesus standing at my feet. He said, Jesus looked at me and said, "You are going to become a leader of men." And then he disappeared. He said, "Dad, in that moment, I was instantly rejuvenated." He said, "My strength returned, and I walked back into base camp smiling from ear to ear." You see, what had happened is he had now become a man that was prepared to lead other men into battle, fully prepared to go to war. And bringing young men like Deke into this place is why the Army puts them through such training. It's not because the Army hates them. Nobody in the Army hated Deke. Nobody knew who he was. They didn't hate him. It was to prepare him for leadership in the heat of battle. And this is the same reason God directed Elijah the Tishbite to go into the Wadi. It was to prepare him for battle. Now this is the same reason that God has sent many of us into a wilderness place where sometimes we feel cut off and alone. Yes, God often sends His children to where He alone knows where they are. You know why? Because He alone knows what we need. And He says to us, I want you to learn to depend on me. Totally and completely. Now, beloved, I know God does this. I know He prepares it because He's done it to me. He's taught me again and again that He alone is my provider. And I have learned to lean on Him. But this sermon is not about me, it's about Elijah. Now, just listen to how God provided for this man. It's found in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 4 through 6, and it reads as follows. And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded... Now, if you question the Word of God, this is going to challenge you down to the core of your being. And I have commanded the ravens, a bunch of carrion birds who like to eat meat, Hello? To feed you there. Are you with me? Next verse. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord, for he went and stayed by the brook Wadi, which flows into the Jordan. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. Now, here's one thing I want all of you to know. Always remember this. The calling of God is always accompanied by the provisions of God. If God calls you, God will provide for you. God will not call you to a task and not provide you with what you need to fulfill that task. I went to Carmen. We were starving to death. I want you to know we were starving to death. My children, I had to sell milk bottles to buy milk for my kids to drink. My wife and I ate beans, pork and beans from a can, about 4 or 5 times a week. That was all we had. Pretty soon I began to get a little angry with God. And one night I went to my office. I sat down in my chair. I leaned it up against the wall, just laid my Bible open in my lap. And I said, God, you failed me. You led me into this canyon, and here I am, and you promised to provide, and you haven't provided anything. That's what I said. God said, look down. I looked down. My Bible is open to the book of Isaiah. I just had opened it in my lap. And the Word of God said, if you are willing and obedient, see, did you hear those words? Willing and obedient, you shall eat from the fat of the land. And I said, I don't care what it says. I'm not only not eating from the fat, I'm not eating anything. We were having a special offering the next morning we were taking for missions. And I'd ask everybody to bring $50. God said, take one of those checks right there, write it for $50, go out there right now. If this is 3 o'clock in the morning, go out there and put it in the offering plate. I said, I'm not going to do it. I'd go to jail. That check would be hot. That'd risk my reputation. I said, see, you're not willing or obedient. I said, okay, I'll show you. So I just wrote a $50 check, took it out there and placed it in the offering plate. Got up the next morning, preached a sermon, go stand at the back door. The guy comes through. I feel him slip his hand in my pocket. He said, Pastor, just want you to know I love you. That's odd. And pretty soon another guy came through. The pastor just wants you to know I love you. Flipped his hand into my coat pocket. Getting straight. Pretty soon another guy came in. This guy's name was Brett Jeffries, one of my favorite people. He said, Pastor, just want you to know, last night about 3 o'clock in the morning, Holy Spirit just got all over me. And he said, I've decided I'm going to put a half a beef in a locker for you in Tacoma. And as long as you're our pastor, there's going to be a half a beef. I went, whoa. I'm really feeling willing and obedient right now, Lord. I go home. I remember the hand in my pocket, so I reach in, and there's 2 envelopes. I take one of them out. Inside one of them is a little note, inside of which is a check. Pull the check out, and it's a check for $500. Little note that just felt impressed to do this. $50 in the offering plate, $500 in my pocket. Then I opened up the other one, and it said, Pastor, go to S&Q Clothing. Buy 2 suits, 2 shirts, 2 ties, 2 pairs of shoes, 2 pairs of socks, 2 of everything. Then go to Cold Irons, buy clothes for your kids, for your wife. And then this little note. Money, no object. Now, beloved, if God calls you, God will provide for you if you are willing to be obedient to Him. If you're willing and obedient, the promise is you'll live off the fat of the land. That was my first lesson in how to survive the wadis of life. God taught me in a powerful way. Now, think about how God provided you. There was water. He needed water, right? The water's flowing down the wadi. God's providing from a spring coming down the wadi. Now that in itself wasn't so awesome. He also had a cave that would shelter him. And that in itself was not so awesome either. You know, there's lots of caves around that part of the world. The miraculous part was what I said a moment ago, that Elijah had bread and meat to eat on a daily basis, and it arrived in the beak of ravens. Great big black birds. Hello. Are you with me? That's incredible, right? Only God could think of such a thing. I'm sure that Elijah had to sit there and watch those birds come and drop that food in his lap and go, what's the matter with those birds? That's strange. Now, don't you start in. Well, yeah, I guess so. Did you hear that? The birds were willing and obedient. Now, I ask you this. Food from birds. What more could a man of God ask? Every time those birds flew in, he had to think, wow, God is great. Now, I'm sure that the prophet was very content in this place, don't you? I mean, every day, twice a day, the birds drop off his food. He's got plenty of water. Everybody else is running out of water. He's got plenty. But now, I want you to remember this. Sometimes the people of God are subject to what other people are experiencing around them, right? And so what's happening in Israel? He said it ain't going to rain no more, and now a year's passed by, and it ain't rained, and guess what happens? His brook dries up. It ain't going to rain anymore, meant it ain't going to rain where he is either. So the Middle East was now waterless. The springs no longer flowed, and all that was left in the wadi was the barren stream bed. Now, I wonder if Elijah didn't experience a little bit of doubt, a little bit of fear at this point. I wonder if his faith didn't waver just a little. After all, you can't live in the desert heat of the Middle East without an adequate supply of water. And this was a real crisis of faith for God's man. And as the brook began to run dry, I wonder if he didn't think, I wonder if God has deserted. I used to have all of this stuff here. I wonder if God has deserted me. I wonder if I failed in some way. I'm sure he gave in to a lot of self-examination. Now, I ask this question because I've been where Elijah was on more than one occasion. And I thought that God had failed me, but I can assure you in time I learned God doesn't fail His people. He never fails. He never leaves us. He never forsakes us. Sure, our brooks run dry. Hello? Scotty, I remember when your brook ran dry about 3 years ago. It was a crisis, buddy. There was no water in your stream. You didn't know which way to turn. Thank God you had a family. Your church cared about you. Sometimes that's just the way things are. Our brooks run dry. And the resources that we've depended upon to provide for our necessities are suddenly not there anymore. At least not in that place. As I said, I've been there before. That spouse we depended upon to be at our side walks out, leaving us high and dry, and we feel deserted. I know about that. I've been there. Our health, which has been so good, suddenly begins to crater. The doctor tells us, Carol, that we've got cancer. We feel helpless at times and all alone. Now, I don't know about that, Carol. I've never been where you are. But when we're standing there beside that dried up stream, we must look to God. And I can promise you one thing. He'll still be on His throne. See, no matter what our situation is, God will still be on the throne. He will not have forsaken you. And believe me when I tell you that He has other resources of water other than the ones that we have come to depend on. See, God isn't limited by any of that. God always has a plan. Sure, our streams dry up, but thank God they do. Those dried up streams provide the opportunity sometimes for God to give us something far better. And oh yes, here's something else you should know. When some brook or other dries up, God is often closer to you than He's ever been in your entire life. You can't see Him, but He's drawn near to you. You see, God is constantly busy preparing a new channel of blessings to supply you with more than you ever thought or imagined you would ever have. But you'll never access that new channel of blessing till you make the decision to leave that old dried up stream bed. And sometimes we Christians have to do that. Sometimes we have to step out on faith. Sometimes we have to move from what has been comfortable to us to something else. And when we do, God will always have something bigger and better for us. Now that's not to say that the time we spend behind the now dry stream was wasted time. It wasn't. It was training for spiritual warfare. And when the stream dried up, it was just another phase of our training. And that was certainly true in the case of Elijah. God was shaping one of the greatest spiritual warriors of all time. There would never be another one like him. You see, very soon now there was going to be a war in a place known as Mount Carmel. And the Wadi was only phase one of Elijah's training for that conflict. His experience beside the Wadi taught him to depend upon God and upon God alone. He had to learn that before he could persevere when the war came, and the war is on the way, as we're going to see next week. And now here's my point this morning. You said, Pastor, why didn't you make it 30 minutes ago? Well, I wanted to save it to the last. If you're a child of God and you're going through a struggle today, God may be preparing you for a great victory. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jim. If you don't know that, I feel sorry for you. If you do know that, it will help you deal with any dried up brook in your life. You see, what we've got to do, beloved, is cast ourselves upon the Lord, and God will meet our needs. I can promise you that. Do you need salvation? Come to Him. Turn to Him. Is your financial brook dry? Turn to Him. Come to Him. He'll provide. Do you feel abandoned and forsaken? Come to Him. He'll provide. Whatever your need is today, God will meet you. You see, in those remote wadis, that's where God often hangs out. And when He gets you there, He begins to whisper in your ear. Later on, Elijah's going to have an experience. We're going to see it. He's going to go to a cave. I've been in that cave on Mount Sinai. Some deal, I'll tell you for sure. God led him out to the mouth of the cave, and there he saw a great whirlwind go through. He saw a great fire break out. He saw a great earthquake. And he said, God, what are you saying to me? I said, I'm not in that. And then all of a sudden, he hears a still small voice. He said, you think you're all alone serving me? He said, let me make something clear to you, my man. There's 7,000 men in Israel who've not bowed their knee to the Baal. See, God's there. He's ready to speak to us if and when we're ready to listen. Don't let your problems overwhelm you. Our God is greater than any problem you've got. Can I say it again? Our God is bigger than any problem you've got. And God is the provider. Remember what He called Himself in the Old Testament? Jehovah Jireh. my provider. We used to sing that song. Jimmy, whatever happened to those songs? I was called one day to come out and do a citywide revival by the Ministerial Alliance of, what's that city in the Panhandle? Starts with a G. Ghana. The Nazarenes, the Assemblies of God, the Methodists, Lutherans, everybody getting together, going to have a 3-night revival featuring yours truly. When I got there, the Assembly of God pastor met me. He said, what kind of songs do you want us to sing? So we don't care what they are as long as you don't sing any of those danged old Hebrew war songs. All of a sudden I decided that community probably needed a few Hebrew war songs. But you remember that song you sing? Jehovah Jireh, my provider, His grace is sufficient for me. Listen, beloved, His grace is sufficient. Elijah found it out. You can find out. So, when your brook runs dry, don't look at it as the end all. Look at it as God's provision for a fresh beginning. God's prepared to do something supernatural.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to help spread the word, please give us a 5-star review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Don't forget to connect with Ariel Ministries on Facebook and Instagram and subscribe to our email list at arielministries.com. That's Ariel spelled A-R-I-E-L. We look forward to keeping you updated on upcoming episodes and projects. If you would like to support the missional efforts of Ariel Ministries in Tharaka, Kenya with Each One Feed One, we'd like to remind you that 10% of all donations to Ariel Ministries will support this missional effort. Visit arielministries.com/give for online donations and other methods of giving. To learn more about the Tharaka mission, you can visit arielministries.com/missions. You can also listen to episode 26 for a deeper dive into how our relationship with Each One Feed One and the McCarter family started over 35 years ago, where we are today, and where we're headed in the future.